Okay, so what you have in front of you now is kind of the key that went along with that chart, the flow chart that you tried to build yesterday. So I haven't actually cut this out and put these in order, but I've numbered them. And the numbers stand for kind of the order in which blood would flow through all of these different parts of the circulatory system. So why don't you just take a look at your chart a minute and see if starting with the right atrium, number 1, did you have the blood flowing through the tricuspid valve, and then number 3, flowing through the right ventricle, and so on. And then just pay attention to the colors. Blue is representing deoxygenated blood. Red is representing oxygenated blood, and then of course the green here, you probably use purple, but the green represents the place where you're going to have some gas exchange. So here's a picture of the heart, and it gives you an idea of how blood flows. So it's kind of a descriptor of how blood flows, and we'll just kind of look at this visually a second. So I'll just start this animation.
A thick septum divides the heart into a right half and a left half. Each half is further divided into 2 chambers by an atrioventricular, or AV, valve.
Okay, so let's talk about the septum really quickly. Maybe a good way to remember the septum is by a condition that actually has a damaged septum. Have you ever heard of somebody being born with a hole in their heart? Have any of you been born with a hole in your heart? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I know that Julie was talking this morning. Yeah, she had a really premature birth, but she said she had 2 holes in her heart. Well, what is that actually? Well, it's a hole in the septum. So there's a hole in there, or maybe multiple holes, and then that septum is this divider between the 2 halves. And you can imagine if you've got a hole in that, the blood is going to start moving from one half to the other, and that's not good. This heart pumping, the blood flow is all one way, and that's the purpose of the valves. That's one of the purposes of the septum. And so you can't have, leaky valves. You can't have holes in the septum, because all of a sudden then the blood doesn't travel in its correct direction, and that makes the heart inefficient. It doesn't pump well, and all the rest of it.
Click the quiz button to check what you have learned. The right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the superior vena cava, from the head and arms, and the inferior vena cava, from the trunk and legs. Blood moves from the right atrium through the right AV valve and into the right ventricle.
So just remember, of course, these vena cavas are just great big veins. That vein basically collects all of the blood from all of the veins above the heart. So the heart and above, so from your head, from your shoulders, all the rest of it. This inferior vena cava would kind of collect all the blood from below the heart. So your legs, your trunk, your digestive system, and all the rest of it.
Ventricle receives deoxygenated blood from the right atrium by way of the AV valve. The ventricle pumps this blood out through the right semilunar valve and into the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery carries the deoxygenated blood to the lungs. The left atrium receives blood from the left and right pulmonary veins. This blood comes from the capillary beds in the lungs and is well oxygenated. From the left atrium, the blood moves through the left AV valve into the left ventricle. The left ventricle receives well oxygenated blood from the left atrium by way of the left AV valve. When the left ventricle contracts, blood is forced through the left semilunar valve into the aorta, which carries it to all the major arteries that run throughout the body.
So if we're going to trace the flow of blood that goes from the body to the heart and so on, it would look something like this. So blood is going to come in to the right atrium from these 2 vena cava. It's going to flow into the right atrium. Atrium just means gathering place. We've got an atrium downstairs in school, a big atrium. It's a gathering place for people. Just means gathering place. So the place where blood gathers. Okay? It's going to head through your tricuspid valve and into your right ventricle. The ventricles are the pumping chambers. They're going to send blood somewhere now. All deoxygenated blood because this blood has just returned from the body and has dropped off a lot of its oxygen. From the right ventricle, it's going to head through the semilunar valve and out the pulmonary arteries. So one to the right lung and one to the left lung. So if we put our lungs in here, you can maybe start to get a sense for what's going on here. Okay, so blood would come to that lung there, and it would head to this lung here. And of course, these are the pulmonary arteries. Now, just make sure that you remember, nearly all arteries in the body carry oxygenated blood. Okay, they're carrying blood away from the heart, and most of that blood is oxygenated. But here's a big exception. These arteries, probably the only arteries, unless there's a child that you're carrying, and that's a little bit different. There's a situation there too. But here, these arteries carry deoxygenated blood, and that's very unusual. That's a great test question, by the way. Which arteries in the body carry deoxygenated blood? Answer, pulmonary arteries. They're about the only ones. Okay, blood's heading to the lungs, and then of course we're going to get gas exchange here. So what kind of things are going to happen there? We just studied that in respiration. We know coming into the lungs and then making its way to the alveoli, this blood, and then we're going to have carbon dioxide coming out of the blood and coming out of the lungs and into the blood. No, other way around. Out of the blood and into the lungs, so we can breathe it out. We just studied that, and it's, what form is that carbon dioxide in? Well, 70% of it's in bicarbonate ions, and 23% of it is attached to hemoglobin, and 7% of it is just diffused in the plasma of the blood, right? We talked all about that last week. CO2 is going to come out of the blood and into the lungs to get breathed out. And then as that is also happening, we're getting oxygen is going into the blood from the lung, right? Diffusing into the blood, and then that blood is going to return. It's going to return oxygenated. Okay, so here it comes, and it's heading back into the heart. But now all of this blood has this nice, rich oxygen, hopefully 100% saturation. All this hemoglobin carrying all this oxygen. Okay, it's going to come into now another atrium, but this is the left atrium now. Atrium gathering area. Blood gathers there from the lungs. It's going to go through your bicuspid valve and into this chamber right here, which is your left ventricle. And then that ventricle is going to pump blood through the aorta and out to your body. Okay, to your head, to your arms, maybe to your other arm. And then don't forget, there's on your handout, there's a little vessel or a big vessel down below. That's the descending aorta, because this blood is going to come down a little bit behind the heart, and it's going to keep on heading down to your legs and all the rest of the lower part of your body. So that's kind of how that blood flows, and then it's going to, of course, go through all of the places in your body where oxygen needs to get dropped off, and then it's going to come back, eventually through your vena cavas and back to your right atrium again. So here's a little visual of these two kinds of circuits. So let's take a look at what this might be all about.
There are two circuits for blood flow through the human cardiovascular system. The pulmonary arteries carry oxygen-poor blood from the heart's right half to capillary beds in the lungs. Pulmonary veins return oxygenated blood to the heart's left half.
Okay, so if we take a look here, we can see blood is coming into the right atrium, through the tricuspid valve, into the right ventricle, and then it's going through your semilunar valve. And what would this big long tube right here be? That would be your pulmonary arteries heading to the lungs. And you can notice it's all blue blood, so to speak, deoxygenated blood, and then the gas exchange is happening in your capillary beds, and carbon dioxide's going into the lungs and oxygen's coming into the blood, and then it's returning to your left atrium and then into your left ventricle, and it's getting pumped from there. So you can kind of see that this is one of the circuits of your blood. Okay, this is the pulmonary circuit. Okay.
The systemic circuit is the longer route. Oxygenated blood is pumped from the heart's left half into the body's main artery, the aorta. Blood flows to smaller arteries, then arterioles, and then capillary beds in all regions. For most of the systemic branches, blood flows through only one capillary bed. The exception is the blood that flows first through capillary beds of the intestines. It flows next through capillary beds in the liver. This arrangement delivers nutrients and other substances absorbed from the intestines to the liver, where they are metabolized. Veins return deoxygenated blood to the heart's right half. Now let's see what you have learned. Drag the appropriate text.
So the next topic is just this whole blood pressure topic, and exactly what is blood pressure and how do you measure it and what kinds of things influence it and those sorts of topics. So quick definition for you. What is your blood pressure? It's the measure of the blood pushing against your arteries. So your arteries are under considerably more pressure than your veins are, because they're closer to the heart, closer to the source of the pumping, and so there tends to be more pressure. So when you put a blood pressure cuff on, you're really measuring the pressure in one of the major arteries in your body. Okay, it's measured. The unit is millimeters of mercury. Now we don't use that very much anymore. That's not a metric system pressure unit. That's an imperial system measurement. We use kilopascals or pascals, but in this particular sense, that has never been adopted. So when you measure blood pressure, it's measured in millimeters of mercury. And we'll talk a little bit more about that on Monday. So there's actually three things that kind of influence blood pressure, change blood pressure, and here's the first one. The size of the diameter of your arteries. So let's just take a look at two arteries. Here's artery A and artery B, but there's something going on in artery B. Artery B has some plaque buildup, some gunk coming inside, and so you can see the diameter is getting smaller and smaller as this artery fills up with plaque, which maybe is caused by too much saturated fat or something like that. Now, as that diameter gets smaller and smaller, what do you think would be happening to the blood pressure? It would be increasing. Okay, so just that one's not so hard to see. So one of the influences, one of the things that changes blood pressure is the diameter of the arteries. And as the diameter decreases, the blood pressure will increase. So that's kind of what's been written there. What's the second thing that kind of affects blood pressure? Well, it's that one. The quantity of blood being pumped. And so if you think about that for a minute, if you were pumping less blood per minute, and then all of a sudden, let's say you started exercising, and now because your heart is pumping a little faster, more blood is being pumped per minute. What do you think is going to happen to blood pressure? It's going to go up. So more blood pumped per minute, your blood pressure is going to go up. So what do you think exercise does to blood pressure? Increases it, because all of a sudden, at least in the beginning your heart is pumping harder, it's pumping more blood per minute, so your blood pressure is going to go up. And then the third thing that can actually influence your blood pressure a little bit is the viscosity of your blood. What does that mean? That's how thick it is. So the thicker your blood is, the harder it is to move around, the harder your heart has to work, and that could influence your blood pressure a little bit. So athletes, this is a really good reason why you should stay hydrated. Brittany Heinen is running around the basketball court. She hasn't had any water to drink all day. And by the third quarter, she's sweated a fair bit. What's happening to her blood viscosity? It's getting thicker. Now her heart has to work harder to pump blood around her body. Well, she doesn't want to use energy, extra energy for that. She wants to use it to run and all the rest of it. So now all of a sudden, her athletic performance might be hindered a little bit because she's not hydrated. So you need to make sure you stay hydrated so that your blood can flow properly and your heart doesn't have to work too hard. So those three things are kind of what can influence your blood pressure. So if we talk about this number 2 a minute a little bit more, we're going to kind of measure the quantity of blood being pumped, and we're going to do a little lab for that. And so the quantity of blood being pumped is known as your cardiac output. So we'll just kind of define cardiac output a minute. So you have a handout in front of you, and question number 1 is define the terms cardiac output and stroke volume. So let's just talk about that for a minute, and then we'll do a little bit of a lab that goes with this. So what is cardiac output? Well, cardiac output is simply the amount of blood your heart can pump in 1 minute. And I'll just add it's measured from your left ventricle. Okay, so if you can measure how much blood is leaving your left ventricle every minute, that's called your cardiac output. So cardiac output is dependent on 2 things. It's dependent on your stroke volume. And what is your stroke volume? Well, your stroke volume is the amount of blood that leaves your left ventricle with each pump. So that really varies in people. It depends how strong your heart is, and it would also depend on whether you're exercising or not. So right now you're all kind of sitting. So do you think all of the blood in your left ventricle is actually leaving your left ventricle with every pump? No. You're actually sitting there, and maybe only about half of the blood in your left ventricle is leaving in one pump. You don't need it all. But as you start exercising and your heart starts to contract harder, more blood can leave with each pump. And if your heart is stronger, more blood can leave with each pump. So your stroke volume can change, and here's maybe a range. Maybe your stroke volume varies from about 50 milliliters per pump to maybe 150 milliliters per pump, or maybe even more if you're a really well-conditioned athlete. So for this little lab that we're going to do, because there's no way for us to actually measure that, we're going to use the number 75 milliliters. We're just going to pretend that no matter what you do in this lab today, every time your heart beats, 75 milliliters of blood is leaving your left ventricle. So that's the number we're going to use. Yeah, so if you have your handout there, and if you turn the page over, there's this little data table there, and in the third column it says stroke volume in milliliters. You can write 75 milliliters in all of the boxes. That's just the number we're going to use because we can't actually measure that. And then the other thing that stroke or cardiac output depends on is your heart rate. So obviously the more beats per minute, the more blood is going to be leaving your left ventricle. So as your heart rate increases, your cardiac output will increase. So the lab that we're going to run with then involves you, if you want to turn over to the back side of that page a minute, you can see what we're going to do. You're going to calculate your stroke, your cardiac output when you're just sitting. Then you're going to calculate, then you're going to relax even more. You're going to go lay down somewhere, lay on the side shelf or lay on the floor or whatever you like, and try to get your heart rate to go even slower, and then measure your cardiac output from that. And then you're going to do 2 minutes of really vigorous exercise. So go running up and down the stairs for 2 minutes, go for a quick zip down the sidewalk and back. After 2 minutes, take your pulse rate and then find out what your cardiac output is after 2 minutes of exercise. And then I'd like you to answer questions 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the handout. So we're going to try to do that all before the bell rings.